Hi, I'm Sonja Klinsky, and I'm an assistant professor at the School of Sustainability at ASU. For about the last 10 years, I've worked on one main topic, and that is the intersection of justice and climate change. When people first hear that, they're always a little confused. Why do justice and climate change have anything to do with each other at all? So that's what today's discussion is about. I want to lay out for you some of the reasons why I think we can't talk about climate change without also talking about justice. But let's first just take a step back. I know many of you are coming at this from various angles. Let's just remind ourselves about climate change a little bit before we move on. So in this slide, you'll see there's an Earth and there's kind of an atmosphere. Well, this is called the greenhouse effect. We have an atmosphere around Earth, and it keeps some of the solar radiation from bouncing back out into space. If we didn't have it, we would have no warmth on the Earth at all. So it's essential. The problem is, as we burn things called greenhouse gases, that layer is better at absorbing heat and allows less of those rays to go back into outer space. So instead of having a nice sort of comfortable blanket around us, the blanket is getting thicker and thicker. Imagine all of a sudden you have a feather duvet on your bed in the middle of August as opposed to the nice thin sheet you thought you had. So that's kind of how climate change works. So one of the conversations you might have had with people in the past is, well, how do we know it's greenhouse gases? And what about all the other things that might have been changing the Earth's climate? It's a very complicated system. And it is a complicated system. So in this graph, I've laid out the observed temperature from about the 1880s until now. So before the 1880s, this was before we had a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And then we can lay other things on top of this to sort of see what's the relationship. So we can look at orbital changes, which is how the Earth changes, how it goes around the sun. We can see, have there been any fluctuations since sort of the late 1800s? And we see, no, not really. We can look at other things. We can think about solar irradiance, which is how much solar radiation the sun is putting out. And we can say, have there been any differences there? And we see, actually, no, not really. Another common one is volcanoes. And so we know that at certain times, volcanoes release an enormous amount of material into the atmosphere. This definitely has happened, and it happens very erratically. But if we average it out since the beginning of the late 1800s, early 1900s, we see that it really averages it out while temperature has continued to go up. Now, what are some of the other things that we might look at? Well, we might look at all the natural factors put together, and that's what this slide is, where we're looking at all the natural factors. Then there's been some other things that have happened on Earth. We've deforested a lot of trees. We've changed our landscape a lot, and that definitely has impacted. We have less forests now than we used to. We could say, well, there are other things that have happened. We've reduced the ozone layer, and then we allowed it to grow again. So there's been some fluctuation there. But again, when we look at this, we see there's been a little bit of fluctuation, but it doesn't have the same shape as the observed temperature. We could say, well, what about other things like aerosols? Now, you might be thinking aerosol like an aerosol can, but by aerosols, what we mean are all the little bits of particulate matter. When you burn something, they go into the atmosphere. They essentially are what allow us to see sometimes a gray smog or a layer. Now, you might think, well, that's funny. Aerosols go down, so why does temperature go up? Well, what aerosols do is they actually shade the Earth. So as we've put more pollution into the atmosphere, we've actually cooled things a little bit because they reflect temperature off, which is a bit of a challenge. If we cleaned up our air pollution in some ways, we could actually reduce that cooling effect, which means the heating effect is more serious than we think it is. And then, of course, we have greenhouse gases. And what are greenhouse gases? Greenhouse gases are gases that come when you burn any kind of fossil fuel. So when you put gas in your car, or you use any kind of coal-burning energy to run your air conditioner or your heating unit, all of those go into the atmosphere as greenhouse gases. And as we can see on this graph, of all the things we've looked at, they're the ones that most clearly mimic the increase in temperature. And when we look over time, this has just been a very short amount of time, but we can look at this in a much longer time scale. So in this graph, we look back 400,000 years. And you see that now we're at a point where we have more greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere than we have ever had in the last 400,000 years. And they've gone up extremely dramatically. This is why people are worried about climate change. It's not just the amount of change we're going to have, but it's how fast it's happening. And therefore, we have to think about how humans and non-humans are going to react to this. Now, that was just a little bit of background, so we're all on the same sort of playing field about climate change. This, as I mentioned, is really thinking about the bigger justice issues. And this quotation that I've brought up on this slide is one that happened to me. I was standing in Durban, South Africa, and I was waiting for the bus. Now, buses in Durban are not very frequent, and they're a little bit erratic. So I was waiting for quite a long time. And a woman came up beside me, and we started chatting, and she was from Nigeria, and she was part of a women's organization that was very concerned about climate change, and were trying to organize women to think about how they were going to protect their families. Remember, women in this part of the world are the ones who are responsible for growing most food for their families. And of course, agriculture is extremely sensitive to climate change. So they were trying to figure out how they were going to deal with climate change and continue to feed their families. And she said to me, as we were standing there, she said, "We're already facing the impacts of climate change. This isn't tomorrow, it's today. How can they not see what they are doing to us? We must have faith that eventually they will see us." And this really struck home for me because, of course, the they that she was referring to are those of us here in North America. How can we not be seeing her, was her question. And this, for me, is the crux of why climate change is a justice issue. It asks us the question, who do we see? Who do we allow ourselves to see? And who do we systematically decide not to see? So there's really 4 main reasons why justice and climate change are inextricably linked, and why, if we're going to talk about climate change, we must also be thinking about this from a justice lens. I'm going to go through each of these very briefly just to give you an overview. So the 4 are the fact that we have differences in historical responsibility. We have existing inequality, which then limits the ability different groups of people have to address climate change and protect themselves. We have very uneven impacts from climate change. And of course, don't forget, greenhouse gas emissions stay in the atmosphere for at least 200 years, which means the car you drove this morning is going to affect your children's children's children, which means that the temperature we've already seen change now doesn't come even from your parents, but from your great-grandparents, or from the Industrial Revolution in England. So all of these decisions have very long shadows. So we have to talk about future generations from a justice perspective. It's simply not possible to talk about climate change without thinking about those who do not yet have a voice because they are not yet born. So let's first talk about uneven causal responsibility. So this map here is a map of the world, and you'll see there's various colors on it. The darkest orange are the areas of the world which have the highest amount of greenhouse gases per person, and the lightest green ones are the ones that have the least. And you'll see a huge variation here. So in the United States, we're responsible for about 20 to 24 tons of greenhouse gas emissions per person per year. You can contrast this with, for instance, large parts of Africa, which are around 1 ton per person, and some parts of the world which are even less than 1 ton per person, which means that every year someone in North America produces about 20 or 22 times the amount of greenhouse gas emissions from someone in, let's say, Central Africa. So we can see this variation, which means even though climate change affects everyone, not everyone has contributed equally. Now remember when I said that greenhouse gas emissions stay in the atmosphere for about 200 years, at least? This next image is one that says, well, if they're going to stay in the atmosphere for a long time, what really matters is the accumulation of them. It's like a bathtub, not how much water is coming out of the faucet that we really care about. Because climate impacts come from the amount of carbon dioxide in the bathtub, not just the tub. So let's step back and ask ourselves, who has contributed over time? And that's really what matters when we talk about how different groups of people and different countries have contributed the most. So we see from this image, the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions over time is the United States. This one country is responsible for 26% of the entire cumulative greenhouse gas emissions we have globally. Compare that to the continent of Africa, the entire continent, 2.6% of emissions. So we see that these injustices in terms of who has released greenhouse gas emissions over time are even more extreme than when we just look at a snapshot in time. We really need to think about it over time. Now, one of the things you're probably sitting there thinking is, okay, yes, but what about China, right? Now, in the last graph, we saw that China has produced quite a bit, and about 13% of all greenhouse greenhouse gas emissions over time. Of course, China also has over 1 billion people. So this graph here is one that comes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And it's quite a complicated one. You'll see on one side it kind of goes up over time, and the other one there's a bunch of lines. Well, let's look on the one side where you see the solid lines first. So on this one you see the green is Asia, and you'll see it's growing very, very rapidly. It's one of the areas where we have the most extreme growth of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. The blue section is the OECD, which includes the United States, and you'll see here that that's pretty much flat. So looking at this, you would say, well, the problem is clearly Asia. They're growing more fast than everybody else. It's clearly an issue for China, which is partially true, but now we need to look at the other side of this graph. Do you see the blue line at the top? That's the average emissions of developed countries. Now you'll notice it's only about 15 tons per person because Europe brings the average down. If this was the United States, we wouldn't even be on the graph. We'd be at 22 to 24. We'd be above the level of this graph. Now if you look at the very bottom of the graph, we see the line per person in Asia. It's going up steadily, but it's still only around 5 tons per person at the highest. It's still below the world average. So the question is, who's responsible? Well, are we going to look at whole countries, or are we going to look at each individual person? Are we saying that an American has more right to the atmosphere than anyone else living in any other country? This is why climate change brings big justice issues. And this isn't a new thing. I love this image because it's an old one. It's from 1991, which is a really, really long time ago in the climate world. And you'll see in this cartoon, there's two people here, right? There's the global north, which includes the United States and all of Europe, Australia, Canada, Japan, and the global south. We're all on one planet. So the question is, how are we sharing our resources? And when it comes to the atmosphere, they've definitely been shared unequally. But if this was the only reason climate change was an issue of justice, it would only be one very minor issue. But of course, there's way more to it than that. And as I mentioned, a second reason what we're worried about is the idea that there are already tons of inequalities globally that we have to worry about. So let's talk about that now. Now we're going to go back to an image of the world. This is another world map. And the colors are really different on this one than the last one we saw. Here, the dark green means the Human Development Index. This is one way of measuring sort of how much capabilities people have. What are they able to do? In this case, it measures education, income, and health together. And you'll see that North America and Australia, parts of Europe are extremely high. They're very dark green. And other parts of the world, like sub-Saharan Africa, are bright red. They have very low human development indexes, which means people are struggling to get very basic needs met. And we can't forget that we live in a world that is distinguished and characterized by this extreme inequality in terms of capabilities and what we're able to do. One thing we take for granted here in North America, for instance, is that we can turn on a light switch and boom, we have electricity. We can see, we can turn on our stove, we can listen to the radio, we can get lights to go to school, we can use a computer. The reality is for the many people in the world, about 1 billion people in the world today, that doesn't even exist. They don't even have access to basic electricity, nor do they have access to clean fuels for cooking. And you might say, what do you mean by a clean fuel? Well, if you're not going out every day to collect firewood or dung from animals to burn, to heat your food for your family, that's what I mean by clean cooking fuel. We see large portions of the population in South Asia and Africa still do not have access to clean cooking fuels. You may say, well, why do we care? Maybe people like collecting firewood. They might like collecting firewood. But A, it takes a lot of time. So imagine if you had to add 3 or 4 hours to your daily routine just to heat your food. Or if you had to then live in a house that didn't have proper ventilation. One of the biggest drivers of mortality in some of these areas for women and children in particular is indoor air pollution. So the fact that we don't have clean cooking fuels, energy access for different populations means they're facing immediate health implications. Unevenly. Different parts of the world face this differently. And so you might say, okay, fine, but what does this have to do with climate change? Well, just take a step back for a minute and imagine you work for a government in Africa. Your responsibility is to protect the well-being of your population. That's your job. You're elected to take care of your people. Now in this graph, this is the crude death rate by the different causes. And you'll see different colors. And if we look at the one under Africa, you'll see the blue color is very large, where if you compare that to North America or Europe, the blue color is really small. Well, what is the blue? The blue are communicable diseases, entirely avoidable causes of death, malnutrition, maternal health problems, child mortality from entirely avoidable things. But why is this happening in these countries? Well, here's our trade-off. Because these countries are dealing with so many development challenges, they have to face decisions. Are they going to invest in basic health infrastructure to deal with things that are entirely communicable, that are entirely avoidable, like nutritional issues that we've already dealt with in the United States? Or are they going to invest in the kind of changes that would allow them to tackle climate change that we don't have to face here? And so you can see that the existing inequality means that some countries are facing so many challenges that they're going to have a harder time tackling climate change, and they don't create that many emissions to begin with. Whereas other countries have already dealt with those issues, and so the trade-offs are different. This is why we can't talk about what's fair effort for different countries until we look at the larger background of inequality. Now, it's possible you're sitting here saying, okay, fine, I get it. The world's a really unfair place, but I'm really worried about the United States. It's not like we have perfect equality in the United States. Absolutely not. And this is another example where inequality domestically limits our ability to deal with climate change. So in this image, you'll see some houses with some solar panels on it. And you might be thinking, well, why is this related to justice or equity? Well, ask yourself, who has investments that can they be used to put solar panels on their roof? Who has that much money? We know that solar energy on a roof in the long term will save you money. But if you're a low-income person, you probably can't afford to put the solar panels on your roof in the first place. Or maybe you're a renter and you don't own your roof. The reality is that because of different kinds of inequalities, different people have differential abilities to contribute to addressing climate change. And it's not until we come up with innovative programs to deal with that that we're going to have any kind of sort of just approach to climate change. So this is just as relevant in the United States as it is when we think internationally. Now, this is just the kind of causing end of climate change. We haven't even talked about the climate impact side, and that's where we're going to move now. So this image here is from Typhoon Haiyan, which was one of the most severe typhoons to ever hit the Philippines. Now, it just so happened when this hit, I was in Warsaw. Why is Warsaw relevant here? Well, I was at the UN climate negotiations. Exactly a year before this, I had also been at a UN climate negotiation, and the second largest typhoon to hit the Philippines had hit during that exact same time frame. And the repeated events of two of the most severe typhoons to ever hit the Philippines during the middle of a UN climate negotiation led the chief negotiator for the Philippines to go on a hunger strike for the entire 2 weeks of the negotiations. So this is what Yeb Sano, his name was Yeb Sano, said. In solidarity with my countrymen who are now struggling for food back home, and with my brother who has not had food for the last 3 days, I will now commence a voluntary fasting for the climate. And so the chief negotiator of the entire country of the Philippines did not eat or drink for the next 2 weeks. I think he had water. And the reality is that these climate impacts are not evenly distributed globally. And the real twist of this that makes this such a deep justice issue is that those issues that have contributed the least greenhouse gas emissions tend to be those who are most vulnerable to climate impacts, like the Philippines, like large parts of Africa. And when you look at the United States, many of the most vulnerable and lowest income Americans are those who are most vulnerable to climate change. This happens globally, it happens domestically. And so we can't, again, even talk about climate change impacts without recognizing first that we're all uneven here in terms of how we're going to experience it. Now, we can get a little glimpse of this in the United States by thinking about Hurricane Katrina. The Gallup poll did a poll just after Katrina, and they asked how many people went without food for at least a day following Katrina. And you'll see here that there's huge variation. We have high-income whites, high-income blacks. The difference there, only 21% of high-income Caucasians went without food for 1 day. 40% of high-income blacks went without food for that day. Now let's look at low income. Low income whites, 29% went without food for that day. Low income blacks, 57% went without food after Katrina. So you see here that pre-existing systems of inequality in our society change the experience of the same event. Everyone experienced Hurricane Katrina, but because of their pre-existing inequalities, that looked very different. And what's particularly scary here is that those changes have been persistent since Hurricane Katrina. So since Hurricane Katrina, you've seen a population decrease of about 100,000 people who are African American leaving New Orleans permanently. In certain neighborhoods, you see reductions of at least 50% of African American populations. And this has had direct relationship with income differences. The income differences in New Orleans, there always was a huge gap between white and black people in New Orleans. But when we look at this after Hurricane Katrina, we see an increase in the racial income gap by 18%, which means that one event layered on top of pre-existing inequalities has deepened those inequalities and made it more difficult for the society as a whole to function in an equal way, which then makes it difficult to do all kinds of other things. And this is exactly, again, why climate change brings up these justice issues. Because if we already have tensions in our society about how we're going to deal with all kinds of extreme events, this is just going to make it that much worse. And this image here, just to remind you, it's possible to expect about 1 meter, that's around 3 feet, of sea level rise by the end of this century. Well, what does that look like? Here's an image of New Orleans under 1 meter of sea level rise. Here's an image of Miami Beach under 1 level of sea level rise. And so when you imagine what happened in Katrina, now amplified, and think about the people in these real cities and what existing inequalities are there today, these are the kinds of issues we're going to be facing in the future. Which, of course, brings me to the last reason why this brings up justice issues: the future generations. This image is one from the Copenhagen 2009 climate negotiations, and you'll notice there's all these young people wearing bright orange shirts. And on the front of their shirts it said, "How old will you be in 2050?" And they wore these all around the negotiations as a reminder to the negotiators, who tend to be fairly old, that they're not going to be around in 2050, but young people will. And systematically we're making decisions as though the decision makers today are going to be the ones facing the consequences, when the reality is it's people who are not even yet born who are going to be facing the true consequences. And so this brings us full circle to this question. Who do we see? Who are we going to include in our decision making? And who are we considering when we're making climate change decisions? This image, this one I want to leave you with, is a young man, of course, with his mouth bound silent. Why? Because he's one of the ones that we've decided we're not going to see. So that is my very brief overview of the climate justice intersections. And as I've tried to lay out for you, these are some of the ways that climate change and justice are so entwined that we can't even think about how to stop climate change or how to deal with its impacts if we don't first stop and ask ourselves, who do we see? Thank you very much.